everybody, and welcome back to session 2 of day 4 at Connects Days. Thank you for joining us and tuning in, and especially those that are tuning in from Europe. It is quite late over there. We don't expect Renaud, our speaker from yesterday, will be up live from Beijing because he was up so late with us yesterday, but we will send him the video. For those that haven't met me yet, my name is Tiffany, and I am your host for the week here at Connects Days. I join you live from Connects Canada. As mentioned earlier, and by our previous speaker, we want to innovate and we need to be brave. And to be brave, sometimes it means making difficult ethical decisions, especially when we think about ethics and emerging technologies. There is quite a lot to be worried about. While we do love innovation, there are very much awarenesses that sometimes can vary problematically, especially if ethics is not at the center. To talk more about this, we are delighted to have Lea Strohm and Jordan Eshpeter join us. Our first speaker, Lea Strohm, will be the Innovation Ethics Lab for Innovation in Zurich, Switzerland. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Tiffany.
Very welcome. I'll let you take it.
Yes, wonderful. I will start right away with this screen share. Thank you very much. So what I will be focusing on tonight is not ethics and innovation broadly, but one specific aspect of innovation, digital innovation, more specifically, which is the ethics of digital design, of user interface design. And I work for Ethix, which is a small company specialized on innovation ethics here in Zurich, Switzerland. Well, we're based in Zurich, we work in the whole of Switzerland, and we've been dealing with these questions surrounding digital design for the last couple of months, or almost a year now. And we've been thinking, well, what are the ethical questions that we should be asking ourselves when it comes to digital design, and how can we maybe answer them? When we speak about innovation ethics or digital ethics, we often think about data first. I think the awareness that there's something wrong with the way our data is being collected, being analyzed, has been around for a while. We've seen movies like The Great Hack, the one I'm showing here, that have been telling us basically about how digital platforms have abused our data and have taken advantage of the data. And influenced certain processes also in a negative way. But what we also realized, and another movie showed us that quite recently as well, is that not all of it is about data and about data being collected, but also about design patterns that underlie these platforms and these interfaces that we use in our day-to-day, and that are some of the most innovative interfaces as well. And most of you might have heard about the movie. Some of you might have seen it. The Social Dilemma was out on Netflix in October. And it showed us how companies are using design features basically to manipulate us, are creating addiction that way, help the spread of conspiracy theories, and really influence also politics. And I think this awareness that there is something not only about the way data is being collected, but also about how we interact with these platforms has risen thanks also to these movies. And one of these, or one name that appears often,
It looks like we lost your sound there.
Oh, she is back. Hi, Lea. We lost you.
Hi, I am back.
We lost you for a few seconds.
My internet connection failed on me. I will happily continue sharing my screen.
That happens. You're talking about ethics in innovation, and bam, your connection is
my connection fails on me.
Coincidence?
Let me see.
I don't know. Let's try again.
Do you think? Yes, let me find the right screen here. So we're here, right? I will, so I was talking about dark patterns, maybe just go back one. Dark patterns, which are these design features basically made to trick us. And now you might think, well, have I seen these dark patterns? Are they really so bad? And I'm just gonna show two of them. One of them is this one right on this slide, which shows us Instagram screen and Instagram telling us or asking us to turn notifications on. And it's interesting because they don't give us an option yes or no, but they give us an option yes, okay, or not now, later. And Instagram will actually keep asking us if we want to please turn on notifications if we click on not now. So they really don't allow us basically to take our own decision based on these, if we want to have these notifications or not. Another one, quite known one as well, is TikTok. So I don't know who of you uses TikTok, but TikTok actually hides the timestamp on your phone when you have the app open, which leads to the fact that I don't know how much time I've been spending on TikTok, and I will probably spend more time than maybe I should. I'm not aware how much time has been passing, and I just keep scrolling through the videos, through the content that is presented to me. This is a dark pattern that is usually called interface interference because they modify, the interface is modified in a way that interferes with my understanding of it or with my knowledge of what is actually happening. And coming back a little bit to, well, why do we have to think about ethics, or why is ethics important when we think about these features of digital design? I really like this quote, which reads that design is what mediates our interaction with the internet. It's the language we read it in. It's not too much to ask that that language be comprehensible and honest. And as we saw in these two examples, they're actually both examples of how this language, this design language, is dishonest to the user because it doesn't allow him either to take an informed decision or also to have all the information that he or she needs in order to assess how much time, for example, she wants to spend on the internet, that app. So us, from the ethics perspective, we kind of, what always guides our reflections on ethics and innovation is this first question. So what are the values that we want to, that guide us in living a good or better life? And so how do these values interact with the technologies we're using and the technologies we're inventing and innovating? And so in this particular case, we're asking ourselves, well, if we think about these design patterns, these dark patterns, which values are put at stake by the patterns that we have seen above by these two examples, but there is also many more in that field. And why should we actually care that there might be these features? So what do they touch upon? And I'm going to give a quick tour of some values that we deem important. The first one, privacy, is very straightforward. I think it's the one we've talked about right in the beginning. So can we protect user privacy? How can we design features in a way that users don't force users to give away more information that they want to? Or how can interfaces be designed also in a way that actually make users give away more information about themselves, more personal data than they would like to, which is a very common pattern that most of us see every day when we click on certain cookie banners on the internet. Second value, autonomy, might sound a little bit high up, but it's actually just kind of explains this idea that we as users should have the information and the possibility to take self-determined decisions and to decide for ourselves how we want to interact with interfaces, how we want to interact with the internet, with digital platforms. And it's also the idea of not being constrained by somebody else in certain decisions we're taking. Well-being refers to, well, physical, but also psychological well-being. And it's actually a value that often when we speak about dark patterns, that comes up a lot, or is really at the center of these thoughts, because many of these dark patterns lead to addiction in some form or another. And we've seen, well, in the psychology and also in research, that actually frequent use of certain social media platforms, especially in vulnerable population like teenagers or children, can have very negative impacts on psychological health. So well-being really encompasses this idea that we have a right to well-being, and so the interfaces should also be designed in a way that guard this right to well-being and health. Accessibility is a specific aspect of design, of digital design, that I think is quite interesting because it also keeps getting more attention. It's the idea that we design in a way that makes it accessible also to people that might have impaired vision, that might not be able to hear. So how can we design interfaces in a way that are inclusive and not exclude certain groups of people based on their physical state or also mental state. Sustainability, a topic that was mentioned before today, is also within this context of digital design. We look at it from a quite narrow perspective. So how can we design in a way that is more ecological? How can interfaces be designed in a way that they use less energy, use less internet capacity? So that is also something that is receiving more and more attention. And finally, community, the idea that we as humans, we need a sense of belonging to communities. We also need human contact though. So how do interfaces interfere with these elements? Sometimes they enhance community building. I mean, that was the idea with a lot of these social platforms, but they also sometimes lead us to spend less time actually in human-to-human interaction, because they really keep us linked to a screen. And so after this overview of the different ethical questions and ethical or the values that we think are important to think about when analyzing design, we at ethix, we are trying to develop a way to actually support these design practices and these values in practice, and create support designers and also product developers, people involved in the design of ethical interfaces. So how do we do that, or how do we approach this issue? Well, first of all, we could obviously look at the product and we could kind of see, well, which of these dark patterns, how many dark patterns are to be found in a digital product, in a prototype, for example. But the product doesn't really tell us why these features are there. And that's often a very important question, is to realize, well, these design patterns aren't there for no reason. They're there because they fulfill certain goals, business goals, other goals that want to be achieved by the providers of these interfaces, these platforms. So by only focusing on the product, we actually don't get that perspective. So we also need to focus on the design process that is often or always an iterative process. So that has the design decisions get taken and retaken at different times of the process. So we came to the conclusion that we have to start including these ethical practices already in the design process, and not only once we have a finished product. And by doing that, we hope that we can create ethically responsible product, or support the creation of ethical responsible product. And kind of the idea, or a very banal idea, is already to include in the kickoff workshops of when a new interface, a new design project gets started, to include a perspective that is often not included, which is the perspective of society. So we often look at the business side, the business requirements, the user requirements, tech requirements, but we forget about, well, the societal requirements, or maybe also the societal consequences that an interface might have. So what we came up with is two things. One is what we call this ethical design audit, where we basically evaluate a product by looking at if it has certain dark patterns, how it is collecting data, processing data, and how it communicates also about these collection processes to the users. We also analyze, as I mentioned, the design process, try to understand how these design features ended up in a prototype or product and why they're there, and if during the design process ethical considerations were made, and in the end suggest action plans or changements, how an interface could be made more ethical in So basically how this looks is, we looked at Galaxus, which is a very famous Swiss e-commerce shop, and we tried to understand, well, what are the dark patterns that are here. This is just a mock audit that we did for this, and try to understand, well, what are these dark patterns and how does this go about. The other thing we're focusing on is to enhance competencies of designers and also product managers in agencies or companies that are developing digital products, to basically learn more about dark patterns, about the consequences dark patterns have, and then also learn how they can avoid certain of these dark patterns, or what alternatives are there to find a middle way between reaching certain business goals or certain metrics mostly, and having ethical interface design. This was it from my side. I hope I didn't overstep time too much. Thank you very much. As mentioned, ethicx is the company I work for. I'm happy to answer questions about anything later.
Thank you so much, Lea. And now for our second speaker, Jordan Eshpeter. Jordan is the Director of Strategy at Invoke Digital. Great to have you again, Jordan, and feel free to pop up on the screen. Welcome.
Yeah, hi.
Hi, it's great to work together again. We got to work together last week at TEDx Abbotsford, and his talk is actually already published, so you can head over to TEDx Abbotsford as well to see another great talk from Jordan. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, yeah, I'll jump right in. Thanks, Tiffany. Yeah, a nice job. Oh, nice job there, Lea. Awesome stuff. And I hope you guys do get to work with these big Swiss companies and other folks, and help them out, because Lord knows they need it. I'm just going to share my screen here. We good?
Yeah.
Okay, excellent. So yeah, so thank you again, everyone, really pleased to be here. I think what I hope to bring to the conversation is something that's just basically complementary to what Lea was saying and what her team at ethicx are doing. Just a little bit about myself, and I'll be brief, but yeah, I'm a Director of Strategy at a digital product studio here in Vancouver, Canada, called Invoke. We work with companies from global Fortune 500 and brand new startups, and our product design studio. Also, I'm just in the midst of working through some graduate studies at Simon Fraser University, also here in Vancouver, part of the School of Interactive Arts and Technology, in the Everyday Design Studio. And then I have these kind of side hustles, which is ethicism, which I'll talk about a little bit more today, and then also Write the Future, which is what I'm just sort of calling myself when I talk about these issues in particular. So I'm sort of all of these things tie together and fit together, kind of neatly, I think, in a way. But this is what I'm generally kind of on about. And a lot of this is informed just by my own work, primarily as a practitioner. So as a director of strategy at a digital product design studio, mostly that's where my motivation comes from, and really just the sense that even though it's perhaps at any one moment we can see kind of an obvious, perhaps kind of ethical issue or a problem that we could anticipate, that really the experience of a designer or of a strategist or of a product manager or of a CEO even is quite complicated. And so actually going on about the work, and I'm sure Lea and her team would attest to this, is like these are very difficult, kind of tangled problems. And so what I've wanted to do, and my motivation, is to try to be able to really work through what I think the forces at work are that make these problems so difficult. And I think part of it, and I'll just try my hand here on this slide, is just to describe that we have humans in the mix. We have the designer, which I think broadly includes all the practitioners that go into making a product. And then we have the user, and past that we have the many users. We have society, right? This kind of big abstract idea of everybody kind of together. And then we have these entities or these non-human actors like companies and like products. And we have this relationship going on kind of all over the place, and kind of strings holding all of it together between people of all sorts, practitioners, users, society, and then these non-human actors as well, companies, products, and other systems and software and things that go into making these technologies and products. So it's kind of a wicked problem to try to untangle and to even speak about for 10 minutes. But surely we have problems, and I think Lea did a great job showing about dark patterns, and also just the point that those are really like utilitarian design solutions to optimize for a business target and goal, generally speaking. So it's certainly a vicious application of design, but it's an over optimization for a particular business outcome, generally speaking. But there's just many other examples. So I'll just spin through a few to help make the point. But I think everyone on this call would know that this is an actual issue. So here we have the notion of algorithmic bias has been in the news lately. That ProPublica published did like a investigative article where they in a county in Florida were able to basically demonstrate that there's an AI system that recommends sentencing or assesses a risk to defendants and folks who've come into trouble with the law. And what they're able to validate through the data is that a person on the left who's a black man was given in this case a high risk score of 10, but ended up having no subsequent offenses, whereas the white gentleman on the right, Dylan Fugit, was rated a low risk of 3, but went on to at least commit 3 subsequent offenses. So a kind of a wildly wrong and harmful and racist application of an AI. Similarly, Airbnb has designed a really great marketplace for most of us, but it seems to have exacerbated or made worse kind of long-standing problems of privilege and power. And so there was a hashtag that got trending on Twitter a number of years ago called Airbnb while black, and it was just to describe the experience of being a black person trying to secure an Airbnb rental and how difficult that was. And Airbnb went on to make a series of kind of gestures and also design decisions to try to overcome that. Probably the most prominent for anyone who's booked on the platform is Instant Book. They've really tried to make Instant Book better for everybody, or more prominently featured, so that people aren't necessarily judging each other on their profiles or racially profiling people who are either the host or the guest. Also, just we've had as a result of COVID, just a surprising, kind of shocking, perhaps partnership between Apple and Google towards the ends of contact tracing. This is not necessarily an ethical problem, because if they are doing what they say they're doing, then the data is secure and our privacy and anonymity is protected. But it is kind of a startling revelation to have these two, kind of giant near monopolies teaming up to kind of put their hardware superpowers together and their access to most of the connected globe anyways, and to be able to then pass data around and see who's been in touch with who. So not an ethical problem just yet, but as we see, perhaps these companies start to partner together and data start to get traded back and forth, we end up in some pretty tricky territories. And then we just have the problem of reuse, where this image is from an article that sort of describes the Google and Project Maven issue, where Google worked for, invested millions of dollars presumably into standing up a cloud computing infrastructure, but then that got sold, somewhat to the surprise of many of the engineers and people involved in that project, to the U.S. military, and the application that it was originally intended for use on is called the Algorithmic Warfare Cross-Functional Team, aka Project Maven. And what it was meant for is to be labeling previous drone footage to train an AI for kind of higher precision targeting on future drone attacks. And there was a revolt inside of Google. A bunch of employees staged a walkout and kind of set a series of kind of actions in play that ended up canceling, getting Google out of the project. And so a good win for employee activists and people with ethical backbone in these large companies, but many of these people were sort of politically edged out of the company over time. And so most of the folks who would talk about this are no longer Google employees. They're kind of Google's part of their history. And so I suppose to design differently, or to design undark patterns, or to have some protections against reuse, military reuse, for example, we have to conclude that that there is some degree of agency for the designer, or for the architect, the cloud architect, or for the practitioner. And while I believe that agency is a thing, and that it is an experience, or is true for people who are designers, and in fact they have quite a bit of power because they're able to do things like make dark patterns. Oftentimes too, they find themselves, like that previous diagram I had shown, sort of in the middle of a very tricky situation, sort of between all kinds of forces and powers, and perhaps to them it doesn't feel like they have a ton of agency and lots of things that they can do. But for our purposes, I think when for these types of conversations, we have to in our minds be able to assign a responsibility and accountability somewhere. So there must be agency, because whoever is the agent is the person or the people or the network of things that is ultimately accountable. So been noodling on this kind of agency problem for a while, and I've kind of boiled it down to a handful of kind of domains where we can, as designers or as people who are practitioners in technology, we can sort of think about this as levels and engage hopefully on all these levels. And I think Lea in her presentation touched on process, that we can design for good. We can have better steps in our processes to design for the person better, but certainly I agree to try to design for society, even though it's a hard thing to think about, I think, in the kind of day-to-day pressures of turning out a product or meeting a deadline. Then there's the product itself. So there's process. You can design the process. You can design the product. Dark patterns, absolutely. Part of a bad product, certainly, and are probably nested inside of good products, as it were, right? Also, like, there's this idea of nudge, where you can design somebody to make a good decision or to take a good action, and then you have a question, but well, what is good? And then kind of this notion of kind of labor power, and this is it's a kind of Marxist kind of phrase there from Marx, but the idea that we are labor, and we can apply our labor to things or remove it from things. So we do have the ability to drop tools, to quit, to walk out, or make the positive choice to go work somewhere that is values aligned, or that has kind of the right kind of governance and structure in place to act, or to enable employees to act ethically. I think there's a political dimension as well when we're not just designing a tool for good, but we're advocating for people. So if we're designing Airbnb and we, through our research, realize, or through our people on our team or through ourselves, are able to identify that there's something problematic about the power dynamics of people who own property and people who don't, and people who have racial bias and people who are simply trying to have a nice weekend away with their friends, that we're actually engaging politically here, and these are political problems. And so we have to have, I think, that as a lens, and hopefully a motivation as designers to act politically when we design. And then also there's the personal. So we have 5 Ps, which is super convenient, but we have kind of the personal or the interior, I think, domain of the designer. And this is what I want to just talk about maybe for the kind of the rest of my time, which is no doubt almost up. But we have these, so when we think about what do we do or how do we do it, we can turn to sort of the big kind of normative ethical schools. If any of us on the call are familiar with these, we can think about greatest good for the greatest number from consequentialism, or we can think about what are our duties from deontology, or we can think about like what are the virtues we should be pursuing as people, or we can think about how should we care for people, a very particular kind of feminist view of how to care for things and people, and what relationships need protecting or promoting. So we can turn to these. We can also turn to applied ethics. So I think in the design and technology domain, there are some kind of emerging toolkits and design cards and things that we can use to help us think about other people or some unintended consequences that might be common enough to include in a framework or something like this. But even there, you kind of have the problem about access. Like, can I invoke, or can I draw on a deontological principle in the moment of decision when I'm making a design, when it might cost me my job? What's a practical solution? I think is something that a lot of people, certainly Lea and her team, and me also, and lots of others are really trying to work through, like, what do we do? And so my proposal, although I agree with all the other kind of ways to go about it, and those kind of 5 Ps, I think are actually a good way to think about where we can act. The one that's maybe, I don't know, elevated for me as most important is one just about self-reflection, self-critique, cultivating kind of an ethical stance, and almost practicing these scenarios before they happen to you, I guess. So what I'm proposing is that ethics are a matter of self-reflection, of self-styling, and of self-conduct to become more of a subject, which is just a way of saying we want to have more power over, or have some agency over, our work as designers or as people who make technologies. And so to do that, one thing that I have done concretely is in my kind of local context in Vancouver here, started like a meetup group or a discussion group where I bring together, I've got an invite list of probably 20 or so people, mostly in Vancouver here, who will gather on a near monthly basis to talk about some of the case studies that I kind of listed off at the beginning, which are actual ones we talked through at Ethicism, but a whole host of others. We're kind of getting towards the end of, like, we're over a year and a half into this project and this group, and the whole point is to gather, what I call kind of conscientious technologists, and to work through these issues and talk them through, and hopefully over time not just arrive at an answer or a framework or a toolkit necessarily, although surely we have had enough things come up where we could have produced that, but to have this kind of ongoing cultivation happening, and this holding sort of each other to account, and these kind of playing the scenarios out in our minds and putting ourselves in the shoes of the actors in the case studies we're reviewing, so that when we're that person, or when we have to decide where to work, or when we're confronted with an incentive to maybe remove some options for a designer, for a user, through the design of an interface, that maybe we have the kind of moral fortitude to stand up against that, or at least to be eyes wide open as to what it is we're doing. And so just a bit on how we run, or I run this kind of ethicism group. is to, first of all, find those people who care about these things like you do, or who are at least curious and troubled by them like you are, sharing a case study to talk through, and then kind of touching on those normative ethical frameworks in your discussion. So just having conversations about what's good, what's bad, who's affected, who are the stakeholders, the people involved, what are good outcomes, what would you say is good in the situation? How could that situation be improved for some of the people who are maybe adversely affected? And then what virtues do we observe, and what virtues should, if these people could do it all over again, would we have liked to have seen? What role could virtue play? And then just share with each other how maybe our minds have changed. It's generally, the sort of structure to these conversations that I lead. And so I'll just end my time by asking, what then will I do, or what then will you do? And I think, as I mentioned with those other P's, that we have to operate kind of at all levels. I think, Lea also touched on this idea, I think, of sort of getting values out. There are values that we probably all agree are objectively important and somewhat universal, although there's still going to be degrees in all of those. And when we think about directly affected stakeholders and users, and then those who are indirectly affected, when we think about society, that list of values becomes much richer, but almost problematic in itself. So we have to do like a real kind of values assessment and prioritization there. And then, as she also mentioned, we can work all the way through to like critiquing an existing technology or critiquing something that's already in market. I think where it's tougher is when we haven't had a user revolt or user feedback, and we haven't had hashtags trending about how brutal our product is for people. But we're working in an emerging space, and where these problems haven't been solved before, and we have a limited budget and a limited time. And so my proposal is that we need to also then work at the level of this self-styling, or of this kind of working towards virtue as people. And for that, I propose, again, having these sorts of almost like co-mentoring type relationships and conversations to hold space together to work through these issues, so that when we are in that moment of decision, we've at least thought through or what to do, or seen how others have done it. So again, my proposal is to kind of work also at the virtue level as a practitioner, and practices like this, I think, are quite helpful. I'll end it there.
Thank you so much, Jordan. We will be moving into our discussion and Q&A session. So I would like to welcome Lea and Johan Rodwee to the screen.
Hi, Tiffany.
Thank you. I'll let you guys take it from here.
Thanks. Thank you both for this very good discussion. I love talking about ethics. I mean, I've worked in the ethics world for a long time. And so for those that the attendees that are join us, feel free to ask questions in the Q&A, and we'll answer them live, or the attendees will attempt to answer them and write an answer. I'll have first a question to start this Q&A here. I think we cannot avoid talking about ethics and value anymore, and because even any product, any digital product that we put out there, or any type of product in general that we put out there, I think it's just a reflection of the values an organization of people have. So you have certain values, and then you put a product there. But it seems to me that then the people with the darker values that invented dark pattern have won. They're the biggest companies. They're the richest. They're the most powerful. So I'm just wondering, in practice, like if you're a young startup, like how do you even start? Like, is it even possible to emerge as a sustainable company that actually makes revenue? Because you need to make revenue to survive. Is it really possible, or have we lost all hope?
Well, I think the reason why I work at a company that does innovation ethics is always the hope that it can get better. If I don't have the hope anymore, I think, yeah, we can stop basically the work we're doing now. But I think we can see that there is actually companies that young startups, innovative startups that provide services with a different business model than the ones that you have been mentioning now, the Googles and Facebooks and so forth, that have very high quality service that they use for a small price, a small fee, but that we're willing to pay for, and that therefore do not have the same business model underlying, and also don't have to recur to the dark patterns or the same design patterns, because they do not depend so strongly on our data and our attention, like Facebook, like Instagram, like these a lot of these big platforms.
But and just to jump on this, are dark patterns, are they always intentional, or is it something that's like an unknown where people is just like, oh, I guess it happened, there's a dark pattern?
No, I don't. The name dark pattern suggests that there is a dark force behind that puts these things in place to like pursue bad things. I don't think that's the case at all. I think a lot of these things are linked to business goals and metrics that have to be reached, and you have to get the highest number of subscribers to a certain service. So you design it in a way that everyone will, by accident, subscribe to it. And it's not because you are a terrible person or have dark values, bad values, but it's literally because you're forced by your surroundings. And I think that's what Jordan showed very nicely. You maybe lack in that moment the agency or the feeling of power to challenge this metric in itself, but not because you're a bad person. I would not say that at all.
Yeah, and I guess sometimes you're just also like within a system, within a company, and you're just trying to do your work and don't think about those bigger things. So that's why I think it's ever more important to have this type of discussion that Jordan is trying to convene. And a question came in regarding this. The question was asking, how can, and I think that relates to Jordan, how can someone not involved in tech participate in the conversation? And I've clarified with the person, they mean generally speaking, participating in an ethical conversation. So if you're not a tech person, how do you participate in a conversation on ethics and tech?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So first of all, I mean, speaking specifically for this ethicism group that that happens here, I mean, I run a bit invite only because we're trying to cultivate like some openness, and so it's not like the kind of thing that is just, I mean, being here today is a great step. I think, to help out the practitioners, because there's a lot of, part of the problem is that there's a lot of good people in these industries, a lot of bad people probably too, but we're not all one thing, and we have, maybe I'm morally upright generally speaking, but I can't resist a nice car, and so I'll do a lot of things to get the car that generally I wouldn't prefer to be doing, and it's I toss and turn at night, and then everyone else is doing it, so I do it too, and then I get the car or whatever. So it's a tricky thing, but I think to help out people, I think for a non-technologist, but for a user, is to train your eye, I think, is the first thing. So I think is to like dark patterns is a great example of something to be looking for, because it is kind of everywhere, and there's various degrees of dark, but it's everywhere. And so it's sometimes just in the motivation of simplicity, which is also a user experience kind of principle. It's very common. So but I think looking for a dark pattern and then calling it out. And I think if users acted more, and they oftentimes do, like advocates, then I think that would actually go a long way. So tweeting these things out and calling companies out for folks like me at the studio where I work, and for the folks that Lea's working with and whatnot, like having things like tweets that we can point to and be like, this is actually bad for your business, actually does a lot of good. So I think when we're trying to design for good or for better anyways, if we're just making the case purely on kind of what is kind of like some classical ethical theory, it's a difficult road to hoe. But on the other hand, if we're pointing to customers, and we're pointing to reviews, and we're pointing to people making noise on the internet, and that becomes more than one person, it becomes a little group of people, and it gains some momentum, Those are really useful data points for those who are internally likely trying to do the right thing.
And yeah, we have actually a question that comes up from Amanda, who's also part of Ethicism. Hi, Amanda. Thanks for
Amanda.
for the question. And I think that question relates to this idea of reconciling ethics and business. And she asked, how could you address the fear in business? For instance, when an ethics audit reveals recommendation to remove a dark pattern, but may result in profit loss. So how do you, what would you tell this business? That's a tough one, Amanda. We can tell she's part of ethicism coming with such difficult questions. But hey, Lea or Jordan, I'm sure you'll have an insightful answer here.
I can try to
she sent us a smiley,
answer.
So that's good.
So we usually argue that if you, as a company, and especially as a young company, if you position yourself in a way where you say, well, we want to argue responsibly, and we want to argue responsibly in the digital field as well, and we're aware of data protection and also forth, you can use that as a marketing tool. So you can say, well, we are actually very much, we care a lot about your privacy. I mean, you have a lot of companies nowadays that really use that as their like key value proposition out there, that say, we keep your privacy and everything we do is keeping your privacy. And this is only a valuable marketing proposition today, because 5 years ago there was a huge outcry, or like how a bit longer now, about how like not keeping privacy was basically destroying our democracy, and so forth and so forth. So I think the fact that we now have companies selling themselves through keeping privacy shows that in 5 years, we'll probably have companies saying, well, we are really ethical in the way that we, maybe not with these words, but the way we treat users in our interfaces, and we are completely honest with our users, and we don't trick them into doing, like, there's no tricking users into getting things they don't want. They only get the core thing, and that can become a very interesting message. And I think we already observed that we observed it in the sustainability field, and we observed it in the privacy field. And I think the next step, or I hope also, it's of course I do not know if that's going to happen, but I hope that the next step will be, we position ourselves in that way, that we are honest to our users and don't try to trick them into doing things that might not be in their best interest.
And maybe to answer that, to give some insight to that question, maybe there's a different way that measuring success in your company, maybe it should not just be profit-based. Maybe we can also include other metrics that is not just profit. And you're like, oh, okay, maybe we haven't has as much dollar that came in for this, but we have ensured that we've treated our clients like honestly. And I really like that term, Lea, that you've mentioned at the beginning about honesty. You had a set of values, 6 values, and I was thinking, like, yeah, even honesty wasn't in there, but I think it's like, hey, let's try to have honest business, honest organization, and that will already just even to talk about it, or even to try it, will already, I think, be a good step. Jordan, did you want to add something to this conversation here?
Yeah, I agree with everything you both just said. I think it's come up before too, but just about B Corp being a great case study for trying to like tie all these things together, even if they don't necessarily totally agree. Like maybe it's better to save money on, I don't know. Anyway, it's probably cheaper to run a business that's not a B Corp. But and not even as a marketing tool necessarily, but even as an employer brand, which I think a lot of these companies are needing talent, and a lot of talented people have quite strong values. So I think it's really effective as an employer brand kind of move. The other thing I would just say is that I think, I remember, I feel like I haven't heard about it in a long time, but there was a time when it used to be like, oh, look at the companies that are worth the most in the stock market, and they're kind of design driven, they're design oriented organizations, design led. And I think it's a lot to ask to be like, oh, well, we should have kind of ethically led companies be the most valuable in the world, perhaps just because that's way too big of a category. I mean, ethics is like just, it's kind of the whole thing. It's how to live. But I think when you pick off one like sustainability as we want to be the most sustainable of something, so you pick kind of even you limit the field of view, something smaller than ethics and ethical, and say like, hey, for us, it is about sustainability, and it is about the long view, and it is about disassembly, and it is about recycling, and it is about those things. And I think, more than being just value propositions for marketing, which is a very real thing and quite important, especially at a cultural level, which is great, in society level. But also just at the pure kind of innovation R&D level, like if that's something you can start investing in, and you can start funding researchers coming out of their PhDs and actually making it core to the not just the value proposition, but to the value itself, then I think you really are starting to get to somewhere. You're creating value, but you're doing it through a lens or for an ends that is ethical, but not itself just like that you're broadly ethical. You're kind of picking an issue and just focusing there, I think. And then I think from there it can be kind of generative for the business. It can be can create value.
Yeah, I think so.
Such is our system.
So I mean, it's good to hear from both of you. It seems there is hope. So this is good to move forward in business and integrate ethics and into the heart of it. And there's a question here from Ben, and it's a question a little bit more like specific. There's a lot of ethics discussion around deepfake videos and social media. What areas do you feel needs an ethics conversation that currently isn't taking place? So we've Lea mentioned the Netflix documentary. We've talked about other areas. We've talked about B Corp. But is there something that we're missing here? It's okay.
I mean,
the answer
is yes.
Ponder. The answer is yes.
The answer is yes. I honestly need to think for a moment, but it's a good question.
So what area do you feel needs an ethics conversation that currently isn't taking place? I mean, ethics seems to now be a lot everywhere, right? People are taking it seems to me, more and more seriously. The danger then could be ethics washing. We had greenwashing, now we have ethics washing. But yeah, it's a great, I wonder, like Ben asked the question, I wonder if he has something in mind, an area that maybe we're totally missing, right? We've talked about ethics and banking. We know about ethics and emerging tech, AI, ethics and blockchain, a lot of areas in ethicism too. You've covered, I think, in ethics lab in Zurich too, you've covered a lot of area. So maybe that's an unknown and we don't know. Go ahead, Lea.
Took me some time of thinking about it, but I think one area that we often forget with these more tech-focused ethics discussion is actually this idea of ethics in transitions. So how do you create a digital transition? How do you create a transition to remote work, for example, as we heard in the previous talk, in a way that is that takes into account the people touched by it? And we're surrounded by people that think a lot like us, that have very similar experiences to us, that have similar resources and education as us, but that actually excludes a lot of the people. And I had a very interesting experience in Valais, so where Johan is from, not too long ago, where we talked about this sudden change to distance schooling in spring during the first lockdown. And that although all of the students in this particular school had access to the internet through their smartphones, because in Switzerland, basically you have everyone has the rate of smartphones is extremely high, but that did not mean that everyone had access to a workspace. So you cannot do 8 hours of school on a smartphone a day. I mean, you can technically, but you will be learning much less than a person that has a computer, than a person that has a good internet connection. And I think, I mean, this is my Swiss perspective on it, but I think these transition periods often get forgotten when we talk about ethics. We look at the technology and we look at what are the risks, such as we did tonight, or I did, but we forget about what it means to put all these things in place. These innovations, these new technologies, and who will be touched by them. And I think that's an area that I would say could need an ethics conversation.
Yeah, so I think that ethics conversation needs to come like at the beginning before you even start designing the product, and while you're doing it, and at the end. I mean, it's and that's what Jordan tries to do too with ethicism. It's a lifelong journey, and I think you just say, yeah, Jordan, ethics is about how to live. So we should not forget that conversation, and in everything we do, right? Ethics in everything we do, and to be bold. I guess that was Tiffany's introduction, to be brave too in innovation, and I guess it's a time to be brave in ethics and innovation. I'd like to thank you then, both of you, to have taken time late evening in Zurich and lunch break in Vancouver. I think it's a good start, a good conversation, a good start, and I hope that it will continue, and the link and relationship between what both of your organizations are trying to do. So thank you very much, and I'll leave it to Tiffany to give us some instruction for the end of the week already, coming up tomorrow.
Thank you so much, speakers, and Johan. Thank you so much to all of you for joining us for the 4th day of Connects Days. We're delighted to have spent this week with you, and don't forget to go and sign up for your conversation starter profile. This will be your last chance, as tomorrow is sadly our last day. Tune in tomorrow. We will be talking about building digital communities as well as the future of food. We look forward to seeing you. Have a great